Greetings to each one of you this morning. I've been blessed by being here and listening to the various testimonies and the different things that were discussed in Sunday school. Dwight, as he was sharing, I had to think of a quote that I have written in my Bible, and it goes like this. It says, "If you look at the world, you will be depressed. If you look within, you will be distressed. If you look at Christ, you will be at rest." Corrie ten Boom spoke that many years ago. And I had to think of that. You know, if we look at the world, it can put us in a bad mood. And I'm just thankful this morning for the blood of Jesus Christ and that we can have victory. Praise the Lord for that. This morning I'd like to speak a little bit about listening to God, if you want to give the message a title. I read a book quite a while ago, and it's entitled Whisper, How to Hear the Voice of God. Very inspiring book. But one of the questions that this book asks is God the loudest voice in your life? And I'd like to add to that, or is his voice just another voice? You know, this day and age that we live in, we are bombarded with all kinds of voices. We are bombarded with all kinds of media, and you name it, it's out there. And it's vying for each one of our attention as we travel life's pathway. There's a fellow by the name of Alfred A. Tomatis. He was born in January of 1920. He lived till 2001. But he was an internationally known doctor. He dealt with ear, nose, and throat. He was an ear, nose, and throat physician. But the way that he actually became a doctor, what brought this was about, he had grew up in a musical family. His father was an opera singer, and Alfred grew up in this family. He spent much of his childhood traveling around with his father, sitting in the wings, listening to his father in these operas. At an early age, he and his parents both decided that this was not fit for him, the opera. Maybe he couldn't carry a bushel, you hear the term carrying your voice in a bushel basket or whatnot. But so anyway, so as time went on, he went into the medical field and eventually became an ear, nose, and throat physician. Soon after he began practicing, his father began referring people to him, colleagues, people that were having problems with their voices, with their vocal problems. And Tomatis, as he had been studying this, he soon discovered that traditional treatments were inadequate. The things that were normally done to take care of vocal problems was not really cutting it. And so he started doing some research on the voice. He started discovering that the average opera singer produces, when they sing, they produce about 140 decibel sound waves at a meter's distance. And if you think about that and you try to compare, what does that compare to? And that's about the comparison of what a military jet, the sound a military jet is making when it's taking off. So you can imagine the sound of someone that sings opera, how loud that can be, and especially thinking of someone that is singing it and hearing it in their own skull, so to say. But this discovery led to a diagnosis. The singer had been deafened by the sound of his own voice. And in Dr. Tomatis' words, he said, the voice can only reproduce what he can hear. So they dubbed it the Tomatis effect. And so you can imagine, you think of someone that is singing and they are singing so loud that they have damaged their own hearing. And so therefore they cannot even hear what they're trying to sing. Therefore, how can I reproduce what really is supposed to come out in a right manner? And as you think about that, as you think about our lives, as we think about going through the Christian life and living for God, could that be the problem in a lot of our lives? The idea that, as you think about what they were finding in some of these singers, is the fact that they could not even hear properly. Therefore, they could not perform like they should. How about it in our lives? Could it be possible that as we think about this, what we think is relational, emotional, and even a spiritual problem could result from the fact that people cannot hear properly, or even more, maybe they don't want to hear. And we hear that a lot these days. We hear people and we see people as they're going through their lives, and some of these people have been talked about this morning, and we look at them and we say, what is wrong with people? Why are they living like they're living? But maybe it's because they have become so deafened to the sound of God, to the sound of God's voice. They have allowed other things to infiltrate their lives, and they have lost their way. And so as you think about learning how to hear the voice of God, what is the solution to that problem? And possibly, like I said, there's maybe a lot of people that don't even want to hear the voice of God, because they're scared that if I listen to what God has to say, it's maybe not going to quite agree with what my ideas is about. And so therefore, it's going to give me a guilt complex, and that's going to be problems. But anyways, in the book, he goes on to say, if your life is off key, maybe it's because you have been deafened by the negative talk that doesn't allow God to get a word in edgewise. Example, maybe you have listened to the voice of criticism so long that you cannot believe anything else about yourself. Or maybe it's the enemy's voice of condemnation that speaks lies about who you really are. How do you overcome problems like that? If you don't silence them, they will eventually deafen you. If you continually allow these kind of things to infiltrate your life, God's voice will be drowned out. Not that He can't overpower, not that He can't give you power to overcome that, but you first have to be willing and allow Him to speak into your life. So back to the question, is God's voice the loudest voice in your life? And maybe I should clarify that a little bit. Maybe not necessarily the highest decibel, but is it the one that comes through the most clear? Is it the one that you hear clearly above all else? God often speaks to us in a still, small voice. But if we're so busy, and if we have so many other voices, so to say, vying for our attention, it's going to be hard to hear that small, still voice of God. And like I mentioned earlier, in our society that we live in, there's a lot out there. Everybody wants to be heard. Everybody wants to have a voice. But if it's not God-based, it's really of no value. Finding our voice begins with hearing God's voice. Turn to 1 Samuel. I'd like to speak a little bit about Samuel's life. And as you probably many of you are familiar with the life of Samuel, and I'd like to begin there in the first part of Samuel, just going to kind of give a little rundown, thinking of his mother Hannah, and probably many of you know the story of how Hannah could not have children, and she prayed, and eventually God did bless her with a son. And she had made a vow to God that if He gives her a son, she is going to give him back to the Lord. And that is exactly what she did. Well, if you begin there in the first part, verse 20 of chapter 1, it says, "Wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son and called his name Samuel, saying, Because I have asked him of the Lord." And it goes on to talk about how, every year they went up to the temple to give sacrifice. And she told her husband, she said, "I'm going to wait till he's weaned before I go up there." And so if you go on down to verse 24, and here's where she had weaned him. So, I can just imagine Samuel was probably, and there's some maybe surmising going on, but, probably in the 2 to 3 year old range. But here we see that that Hannah took him up to the temple. It says verse 24, "And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her with 3 bullocks and 1 ephah of flour and a bottle of wine, and brought him into the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. They slew a bullock and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition which I ask of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there." So we can see here that Hannah was true to her word. She had a son. She took him to the temple. She was giving him to the Lord. If you go on over to chapter 2, and here we see that the first couple verses there, Hannah rejoices. She's singing a song of thankfulness. It says, "And Hannah prayed and said, My heart rejoiceth in the Lord, my horn is exalted." And she goes on to express her gratitude to God. If you go on down through to go over to verse 18. Notice verse 18. This is now Samuel's in the temple there, and it says, "Samuel ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod." And then if you go on down a little further, God blessed Hannah, and she conceived and bare more children. She was blessed. If you go on down a little further, verse 26, "And the child Samuel grew on and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men." Then go over to chapter 3. It says, "And the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision." And now we're getting into the story thinking of Eli. And that's another whole sermon in itself, thinking of Eli and how he had been running the temple and allowing the many things, a lot of sin going on there. And as you go on down a couple more verses there, it says, starting at verse 2 in chapter 3, "And it came to pass at that time when Eli was laid down in his place, and his eyes began to wax dim, he could not see. And ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was, and Samuel was laid down to sleep." So you can imagine, just for a minute here, Samuel is in bed. He's sleeping. And I'm thinking he's probably in the age of somewhere around 6 to 8 years old. How many 6 to 8 year olds do we have here today? Raise your hand high. Okay, so think about it a little bit. Think of Samuel. Think of yourself being Samuel. You're in the temple. Your mom has given you to God, and you are there, and you are ministering. You are a ministering soul for God. And God has a special place for you in His kingdom. And just like Samuel of old, that is something that God has in store for each one of you today. God has a special purpose for each person in this room, whether you are young or whether you are old. Are you allowing and are you willing to be that person that God would have you? But as you think about Samuel, thinking about being just a young boy like this, his mother is not around. He's in the temple each day. He's learning about God. He's there, kind of under the tutor maybe of Eli. And all of a sudden, God comes to Samuel while he is there sleeping. And so if you're this age, 6 to 8 years old this morning, I want you to put yourself in Samuel's shoes for a moment. You're laying there sleeping, and all of a sudden, there in verse 4, it says that the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, "Here am I." And one thing I was really impressed about Samuel, so often we as parents, how many times we call our children, and maybe we don't hear nothing, or maybe we hear, "I'll be there in a minute. I'll be there in a little bit. Give me a second." What does it say here? It says, "And Samuel answered, 'Here am I.'" And it's like there was no hesitation. It's like he was right on. He was spot on. It wasn't no delay going on here. And it says he ran into Eli and said, "Here I am, for thou callest me." And he said, "I called not. Lie down again." And he went and lay down. And I don't know what was going through Eli's mind at this time. Thinking of this young boy, this young lad coming to him and saying, "Eli, you called me. What do you want?" But as we go down further, verse 6, it says, "And the Lord called yet again, 'Samuel.' And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, 'Here am I, for thou didst call me.' And he answered, 'I called not, my son. Lie down again.' Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed unto him." And I don't know what all he means here, but I want to think that maybe I'm sure he had heard of God. He knew who God was, but the idea that we think of a child being pricked in their heart and coming to Christ, and I want to think maybe this was kind of what was going on here. And as he was going back to Eli, and Eli's, "I didn't call you." But I had to think, what was going through Eli's mind? Eli knew what kind of boys how his boys have been acting. He knew that they had been living in sin. And was this something that, in the back of his mind, he's thinking, "Lord, are you speaking to me? Do you have something you want to give to me?" But anyways, 3 times he told him, "Go back. It's not me that's calling." Then you go to verse 8, and it says, "And the Lord called Samuel again the 3rd time. And he rose and went to Eli and said, 'Here am I, for thou didst call me.' And Eli perceived that the Lord called the child." All of a sudden, a light came on. It's like, you know what? God is speaking to him. And then he tells him, he says, "Samuel," he says, "go back, lie down." And he said, "It shall be, if he call thee, that thou shalt say, 'Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. All of a sudden, Eli realized God is speaking to Samuel. God has something special for Samuel. In verse 10, "And the Lord came and stood and called as at other times, 'Samuel, Samuel.' Then Samuel answered, 'Speak, for thy servant heareth.'" That must have been quite a situation, quite a something to